on this episode of Clone Talk.
If you're a small scale grower and your goal is to learn, then making your own nutrients is like 100% recommended. Cannabis almost never gets a real calcium deficiency. Your ornamentals are yellowing and you don't know why, just apply this greener and it's done. So the CalMag is the cannabis greener. The cost doesn't justify that easiness, because you're paying through the nose for that. You're paying 10 times more or something, even like almost 100 times more.
Hey team, Clone Coach here. Are you tired of struggling with your clones? Slow rooting times, purple stems, yellow growth, damping off, and so much more. Now, wherever you are in the world, the best tool to have in your nursery are the Clone Coach SOPs. These SOPs provide step-by-step instructions and expert guidance to get you the best clones ever. Join the team today at clonecoach.com. Welcome to Clone Talk, the past, present, and future of cannabis through the eyes of industry professionals. On today's episode, we have Daniel Fernandez, I should say Dr. Daniel Fernandez, with Science and Hydroponics. How are you today, Daniel?
I'm great. I'm grateful. Thanks for having me here. It's obviously great to be able to be a part of your talk show.
That's fantastic. No, I'm honored to have you as a guest. I think the audience is going to learn quite a bit about the real science of hydroponics here. So, but why don't you let us know where you're joining in from today?
So I'm right now in Valencia, in Spain. So that's where I'm living at the moment.
That's fantastic. I've actually been to Valencia and I've been to Malaga and Cadiz. I spent a little time in Spain one summer in my old previous career. So I love Spain. That's fantastic. Let's see here. So paint the picture for us a little bit, the beginning of your career, how cannabis was either a part of your life or not a part of your life, or affecting you positively or negatively. Like, what was cannabis, like for you growing up?
Yeah, so I grew up in Colombia. So my first, maybe 20 years I spent in Colombia, where obviously cannabis was very highly illegal. So cannabis was never front and center in my life. Obviously, as a teenager, and especially in university, you bump into it. You must have seen the cannabis that we got our hands on. It was more seed than cannabis, I believe. It was absolutely horrible. So basically, I studied chemistry in university in Colombia. So I did an undergrad in chemistry. And while I was doing my undergrad, I was doing a lot of hydroponics just because it was interesting to me. And I've always liked growing plants. And it seemed like I always failed in soil. So hydroponics was actually a way which I could control it, because soil was out of my control in some ways, because I had no way to get soil tests or anything. But then hydroponics I could control. So I found out about it and I started doing hydroponics. And then one of my friends was like, hey, we should build a big hydroponic system and grow cannabis in it. And I was like, yeah, let's build it. Let's build it out. And we built it out. We actually built this huge hydroponic system. But it turned out that the country's attorney general lived right next to my house. He was a neighbor, and he overlooked the place where we had the system.
What are the odds?
so we had to fully scrape the plant, and I ended up growing a ton of other things, tomatoes mainly, and then my friend ended up having the cannabis grow in his closet. So he had an indoor setup, super primitive indoor compared to what we have now.
Right.
Because there were no specialty things we're talking about maybe 15, 20 years ago in Colombia, there was nothing in terms of grow shops or anything. So it was very primitive. But that was like my first contact with it. So I coached him a little bit on it because I was growing my tomatoes. And there was no way we are gonna get any of like the fancy newts that were available in like the US or in like maybe
Hmm.
Europe. So we had to we didn't even have like general, like we didn't even have like any nutrients in Colombia from like brands.
Wow.
And so we actually had to make, so I am making like my own nutrients from raw fertilizers from like day zero, because there was like no way if I was gonna do hydroponics, I was gonna make them myself or like not do it at all. So I started sourcing my own salts from then on. And then I started my blog. I first started a blog in Spanish, which some of you might be able to find.
I'll
where,
dig
where,
for
I,
it. You know,
where I
there's
recorded.
a lot of need for Spanish content for hydroponics, for cannabis, for all of it. So, maybe you gotta revive that thing.
Yeah, I started that blog very early on, so that covers like my journey into tomatoes and all that is recorded there, like all that I learned growing tomatoes, and that was during my undergrad. That blog is still online. I still like keep it alive. I don't write in it. I think that last time I wrote in it, I was probably like 15 years ago or something. But I actually then, around when I was finishing my degree in like maybe 2008, 2009, I started sciencing hydroponics, which is the blog that I currently still care for and write in. And then through like this journey of like preparing my own nutrients, doing a career in chemistry, like studying my undergrad in chemistry, I started doing consulting first for regular growers in Colombia, because growers, like regular, like horticultural growers, did not have access to hydroponic nutrients. So
Mm.
I started doing formulations for growers in Colombia and working with them. Then I started doing some formulations. After I started my blog in English, I started doing some formulations for people outside Colombia in general horticulture. And then around maybe 2012, 2013, and this was when I was doing my PhD in Spain, I started receiving requests for help formulating nutrients for cannabis.
Hmm.
And I had already participated in growing experiences with the plant. So I had some idea of what worked. Of course, like I had no we I had never grown it at an industrial scale or anything by any means. Um, but those were my first experiences with cannabis as a as a chemist and as a consultant. At that point in time, that early on, I think I wasn't even charging because like I was just helping people. That's when I
Get that?
coded
Yeah.
the Hydrobuddy software for, because I realized like there is no software to do it, and doing those formulations by hand was so freakingly annoying and took so long that and the only software piece of software that were available were all these very expensive like general fertilizer industry type things that were thousands of dollars. I mean, they still are thousands of dollars per
Hmm.
license. So I said, well, like, the hell with it. I'm just gonna code my own thing. It is not that hard. I already had a background in coding from when I studied chemistry. I sort of specialized in computational chemistry, so
Hmm.
I knew a lot about coding. So I coded that, and it still has mistakes from like 10 years ago, probably, or more. But I coded
Well,
that, and then that software also made a lot of people contact me, and then I started consulting for cannabis growers, and then a lot of my clients started to become cannabis customers, and like to this day, I consult a lot of the people I consult for are people in the cannabis industry.
if that's the door that's knocking, right? It's hard to ignore, right? I mean, that's where all of the energy and focus for cultivators and gardeners and either hobbyists or commercial scale right now, it's in cannabis. So, I could only imagine having you as that friend, the chemist friend that knew all the hydroponic nutrients in Colombia, 15, 20 years ago when there was no access to nothing, you were probably like the gem, right? Just the ability to have the confidence to, what you're doing and know what you're formulating and know what you're triggering and what the plant is telling you as well. I can only imagine, that value that was there.
Don't. I mean, we killed a few plants, like for sure.
Everybody does. Everybody
it,
does.
it wasn't
And
it wasn't perfect, so like we were also surprised. Like I learned a lot about plant physiology back then. I had never actually seen a cannabis plant before, so
hmm,
those first experiences were very interesting for me. It's very interesting when you first watch a plant grow from like zero to like some sort of harvest. It is always very interesting because each
yeah,
plant is very different, and watching how everything develops, how the flowers form, how then the seeds form, or all of this is very, very interesting. So it is definitely from that point on. I thought the plant was fascinating, and I think that the seeds we had back then were horrible, and like the varieties we were growing, I have no idea what they were. But it was a crazy mix of things,
yeah, I could
for
only
sure.
imagine. I mean, you're talking limited access country, limited access area, like, decades ago. But the thing is that you did it. You went for it. Yeah, you made mistakes, but you also learned, and you're still on this journey, and you're still guiding, other cannabis growers. So, that experience is the real value. So and it's funny that I think it kind of reassures the fact that you have, obviously that scientific brain where you felt more comfortable in a hydroponic situation, growing your own plants versus a soil situation where it's usually the opposite for novice growers or rookie growers. Like, you go soil because it's easier, there's less to worry about, kind of just put some water and, it'll be okay. And hydroponics is you control everything for better or for worse. If you miss a beat, your plants are going to see that. So it was really interesting to hear that aspect, and it kind of reassures, reaffirms the fact that seems that that's the way your brain works.
Yeah, I think that part of my failures in soil were due to the fact that all the soil that I had access to was very clay rich. So basically,
Mm,
I was trying to grow plants in like I mean, it basically on lumps of clay, and it was very, very, very hard,
yeah,
and
no
nothing
oxygen.
grew out of that. Yeah, there was no oxygen, so like nothing ever worked. And I lived in Bogota, which is a very cold city in Colombia, and it average temperature will be like, I don't know, between 65 and 75 Fahrenheit most of the year.
Hmm,
So it's cold for the tropics. But it has a weird combination of being very cold but very, very high light intensity because it's still in the tropics. So
mm,
the plants that are native to that region are very special because it's a very special type of climate.
right.
But other plants that are not used to it don't like it very much.
Right. No, I would assume so. Those are very particular, environmental parameters that genetics will have to evolve to to thrive. You know. Um, that's fantastic. Now, I'm glad we got to know you a little bit more about your background and what you were up to at the beginning, stages of your journey here. And that brings us up to the present, right? Which is your blog and your website, Science and Hydroponics, which is how we came across each other too. Me digging around for hydroponic information, and you were hitting on things that other people weren't. So really, there's a lot of good value there. Um, so let's transition to where things are today, and you talk a lot about making your own hydroponic solution. So maybe let's do a quick overview on what the average person should know or could implement when it comes to making their own hydroponic solution for cannabis.
Okay, so Making your own hydroponic nutrients involves mixing, buying all the raw fertilizers, so all the individual pure salts that you can get, and then mixing those together to form the solution that you will be feeding your plants. This is advantageous in the sense that you control everything. It is not necessarily a cheaper approach if you're doing it at a small scale. It can be at times significantly more expensive because some of these salts are expensive and you need to buy quantities. Maybe you're using very, very little, but you still need to buy a pound or something and it will be expensive.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And you also need to be good at some basic chemistry things. You need to know how to properly prepare solutions, which is not a trivial skill, which is a very significant point of failure in the accuracy of preparation. So thankfully plants are very resilient. So even if you're not perfect, if you're sort of in the ballpark, the plants they will grow. But if you're not very accurate, it limits your ability to learn from what you're doing because every time you're doing it, it's going to be a little bit different. So I don't know if I would recommend anyone at like a very small scale level to prepare their own nutrients if their objective is just practicality and low cost. Then it's not for you because it is gonna be probably more expensive, take much more of your time, and give you a lot more responsibility and make things harder for you. It is great, however, if you want to learn about the chemistry and if you want to learn about how plants react to things, giving you that total control will allow you to learn a lot. So if you're a small scale grower and your goal is to learn, then making your own nutrients is like 100% recommended because nothing will help you learn more than doing things yourself. But if that's not your objective, if your objective is just like, I want to grow the plants and I want to do that cheaply, then you're better off using some lower cost offers of the general like agricultural industry.
So at what scale does it really make sense for you to start buying the raw ingredients, having those on site, and making that mixture, whether it making that stock tank mixture or that concentrate solution? When does it start making sense?
That depends on what you're moving from.
Okay.
So because like right now we have some agricultural mixes in like the general agricultural industry. If you go to like an agricultural provider that does a mixing of fertilizer products, they have some pre-packed like pre-designed mixes, like what you will see like your 418, 38, 5, 12, 26, 15, 15, 15. They have these mixes and there's basically a table of these mixes that was designed 30 years ago because we realized pretty quickly, I say we as like scientists in general, realized pretty quickly that there are like, I don't know, 3 or 4 types of plants that we grow and that they need like these specific nutrient regimes and they're formulated these things. And you can basically go to any one and ask for, I want a standard 5, 12, 26. And they have, it's already like, there's like an SOP to prepare that and they'll make that for you and give it to you. Those can be really, really, really cheap. And so those you can buy those at large scale and they can be in the 2 or 3 cents per gallon of final solution. If you're moving from that, you need to be basically at the scale of the manufacturer to benefit from that. You need to be using like tons of nutrients per year to be able to like justify the move to make a small decrease in the cost. Because we're talking about you would be going from maybe 2 cents to 1.5. So like a 25% decrease. If you're moving from advanced nutrients or from one of the more expensive brands, then it makes sense at a pretty small scale. Like if you have more than 10 plants, it starts making like great sense to move away from those because they're so expensive, And then there are some brands that are more lower cost, like Athena, that might be between 10 and 15 cents per gallon of final nutrients. That might not make sense for you until you're at a relatively large scale, but it depends on what you're moving from. Many times the choice to move is not driven by price though. It is driven by what is required at a facility. So for example, I have a water source that is very particular to my area. So I cannot use like the regular fertilizer offers that are available because my water source is different. So like those people are not formulating fertilizers for my particular water source, and I need something for that. So many of the formulations that I do come more from that point of view. It's like we have a large facility, we have this well water, we have this type of water source, and we need to, or we have these limitations. We can only use like these set of injectors or these concentrations, and the commercial offers are not what we need. So we need something that's custom to us, and that case is much more common than people think. There is also the saving of the RO water here, which is not trivial. Like if a facility is using 20,000 gallons of water per day, producing 20,000 gallons of RO water probably involves wasting 40,000 gallons of water, as a runoff from just the process of removing the salts from the water. Because like you're not just, you don't put 1 gallon in and get 1 gallon out. You put 3 in and get 1 out, if at best. Like if the process is bad, you can put 10 in and get 1 out. So it is something worth considering. Like maybe if you have a small grow, the RO expense is not that bad. But if you're using thousands and thousands of gallons, often people are like, I need to move away from the RO. And when you move away from RO, you immediately need to consider your own custom fertilizer blends, because otherwise it is gonna be hard for you to find a commercial fertilizer that like perfectly adjusts to your demands. And this is like a common problem of fertilizer manufacturers that cater to small growers, and it's that water sources are so different across like the US and Europe that who are you gonna formulate for?
Right.
Because if you formulate for the RO guys, then the guys in tap water are gonna kill everything. And then if you formulate for the tap water guys, the RO guys are gonna kill everything. So this is why you have like lines that have hard water parts and non-hard water parts, or there's many approaches, many ways to skin a cat if you're designing a line. But I also work routinely with people in the industry who are formulating fertilizers to sell. And I've done many of the commercial formulations, perhaps several you are familiar with, but
hey, Daniel's work is out there, everybody. You may not know it, but you may be using his formulation.
Yeah, I've done many commercial formulations that you might be familiar with. Obviously, all of them are under NDAs, and I can not disclose which ones. But in general, like I've done many formulations for cannabis lines. I've done many formulations for cloning products, for CalMag additives, for all the things you can imagine.
That's very interesting. And real quick, you were touching on those 3 numbers earlier for the formulation. Just for people that aren't familiar with those 3 numbers on a very basic level, what are those 3 numbers representative of on those fertilizer packets?
You mean the NPK numbers that we have?
Yeah.
There? Yeah. So these numbers are a relic from before, from the before times. They make little sense now, but
and what does the NPK stand for?
So we have the first number is the nitrogen number, which basically represents the percentage by weight or by volume, depending on where you are, of the fertilizer that is nitrogen by mass. So or volume. So the percentage that is nitrogen. The other 2 are a little bit more complicated. So the second one, which is the P, does not represent the phosphorus. but it represents the phosphorus as if all the phosphorus present was phosphorus pentoxide.
Okay.
So imagine that all the phosphorus you had in the product was phosphorus pentoxide, and that's that number. So it does not mean that the product contains, it doesn't mean that it contains it, but it's just how it's represented. It is because of, this is why this is done this way. It's because before, way before, when you were doing lab analysis of a fertilizer sample, one of the first steps you would do was to basically calcinate the sample. So you would burn it. And the product of burning the fertilizer, the phosphorus at the end of that burning process would be present as phosphorus pentoxide. And then when you did the analysis to determine the phosphorus, it was very straightforward because you measured what you're giving. So you were measuring phosphorus pentoxide and you were just, okay, so I have 3% of the thing that I burned was phosphorus pentoxide. And then it was easy to report, and people didn't have calculators laying around, in the 1910s, 1920s.
Right.
So they basically, and it is interesting that the useful numbers in terms of phosphorus are usually near the same order of magnitude when you talk about like elemental nitrogen. So you get to have things like a 15, 15, 15, which, and in the case of the potassium, it's similar. It's not potassium that you have in that number. It's the amount of potassium if all the potassium was potassium oxide. So that's that number. So you need to convert those. If you want to know the elemental phosphorus and potassium, you need to make a conversion there to figure it out for those NPK numbers. But that's basically why those numbers are reported in that way. It's a legacy thing that will never change, because since it's been done that way for 100 years, nobody will change it, because then the confusion will be incredibly, like right now we all know it's done that way, so there's no problem. There are sometimes confusion with the other things, because usually only NPK were measured, but then people started measuring calcium, magnesium, and then there is an overlap between the reporting of calcium as calcium oxide or as elemental calcium. So generally the fertilizer manufacturers will specify calcium as calcium oxide or calcium as elemental calcium. But these are just like manners of reporting. In the end, the way the phosphorus is present is not phosphorus pentoxide. And this is something that confuses new people to the fertilizer world all the time. And it baffles people. They're always like, why do they do it this way? It makes absolutely no sense. And
I think we just captured the best description and definition of MPK ever out there. And I love it. I love it.
Yeah,
there's a lot more to it, folks.
It did make sense at some point.
Yeah, that's funny. Real quick, purple stems on cannabis plants in the vegetative state. What's a real quick way to address that, and what are you addressing? What is happening in that plant, and why are the stems purple? Why isn't it solid green? What elements are missing in that plant to change that plant from purple to green?
That's a good question, and it is like, imagine the purple stems as a person having a headache. So it's a symptom of stress, because that purple is anthocyanin production in the stems and even in the leaves, and that is done by cannabis plants as a way to express stress. It's a consequence of stress. Now, as a headache in a human, just because you have a headache, you cannot tell why you have it. So it's a symptom that could be a symptom of a myriad of things. There could be 15 things wrong with a plant that could cause purple stems. For example, cold can cause them really easily. If you have a plant that is under a cold, not even cold environment, if the root zone is cold, it can easily trigger purple stems and purple leaves. And so basically when I see that, if you see purpling of stems and leaves in veg, something is or was wrong at some point. So you need to figure out what was wrong and correct it, which means that you need to run through a diagnosis process. Whenever you're talking about plant physiology, as you talk as with any living creature that's complex, like a human, you need to go through a differential diagnosis. So you need to ask, what's wrong? So what does an ideal plant look like? And what does this one look like? What's the differences? So you need to start discarding things uh, regarding nutrition, regarding irrigation, regarding light, regarding CO2, regarding all these different things. Of course, you'll start with the ones that are more common. So
Like?
you'll start with a temperature, for example, which is like a classic way in which this can happen. That would be easy to discard because you just measure the temperature. It's not low.
Hmm.
Okay, we continue.
Hmm.
Then you will look into the nutritional aspects. So what's the composition of the solution currently being fed? Is it what's the media that the plant is in? What's the irrigation? So this can happen due to oxygen stress. It can happen because of overwatering. Like I've seen it happen because of overwatering a bunch of times. So it can be that the plant is just has no oxygen availability in the root zone because it's being overwatered. So you need to check what the drybacks are. Are they adequate? I mean, it can be caused by a bunch of different things. It can also, in cannabis, there are some strains that are extremely sensitive to anything, and you can get a plant that you stressed it one day and then it's now purple,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
and it's never not gonna be purple again, and it might be fine. It might grow normally and yield normally, but it will always have purple stems after that problem because it
So,
like expressed those anthocyanins and they're never going back.
so
So
let's assume that our stressor is due to the nutritional deficiencies. Let's make that assumption. What are the most common, nutritional deficiencies that are causing this purpling, and what are the corrective actions to take?
so in the general plant world, like if we're not talking about cannabis, if you saw a plant like that, you would think it's a phosphorus problem, because when you look at the cold temperature issue, it causes a problem with phosphorus uptake, and that causes that purpling of the stems. If you do the experiment with a tomato plant, if you take a tomato plant and put it in under cold conditions, it will turn purple. And when you measure the tissue, the composition of the tissue, you'll measure a phosphorus deficiency. Not because of lack of phosphorus availability, but because of lack of transport. And this is a common problem in evaluating the issue of a deficiency. A deficiency does not necessarily mean a lack of. It can mean a lack of uptake. It can mean a
Mm.
lack of transport, because you can have uptake. It can be in the roots and it may not make it up the stem of the plant. It might stay in the roots. So we have uptake, which is taking it into the roots. And then we have transport, which is taking it from the roots to the leaves through the xylem. And you might have problems there that are related to that. So is it related to like the nutrients in the solution composition? I would say most of the time it's more related with something regarding the irrigation management that is preventing proper nutrient uptake and transport, or to the environmental conditions. I would say, can those be fixed with like your manipulation of the nutrient solution? Well, I mean, ask all the people using CalMax. So yeah, I mean, yeah, you can sort of like, in, for example, in the horticultural industry, there's these things that have been developed called greeners, which
Mm.
are basically solutions to green up plants.
Yeah.
That basically it's like your ornamentals are yellowing and you don't know why, just apply this greener and it's done. So the CalMag is the cannabis greener, because it's like your go-to thing when you don't know what the hell's wrong, but that might fix it. And
Yeah.
yeah, like sometimes the an approach like that can fix things, even though the real cause could have been fixed without manipulating the nutrition.
Hmm.
I think that increasing the nutrition is almost like an undesirable thing to do, because it's an additional expense and an additional complication. I'd rather find out what the problem is. But of course, that sort of differential diagnosis requires time and effort, and it's not always necessary. If you have 3 plants in your basement,
Right.
it's irrational to expect you to spend like $400 in lab tests so that
Right.
you know what, just like do
Just spray some
in
CalMag.
just spray some like that's basically there are solutions like that are generic that often work because they correct some problems that happen. The fact that CalMax works so well in cannabis has led people to believe that cannabis can easily get calcium deficiencies
Hmm.
when it's the complete opposite. Cannabis almost never gets a real calcium deficiency. It's extremely
Interesting.
hard. Even researchers have a really hard time causing calcium deficiencies in cannabis plants. And
Touch
you
on that a little bit more because like you alluded to, it is the most common thing where it just needs more CalMag, right? And there's a joking side to that, but there's also like, well, it works. Like my plant
I mean,
turned
well,
green, so like,
it's like what I'm saying. Like these greeners in that are used in ornamentals, they what are they? They are usually a nitrogen source, an iron source, a magnesium source. They're calming without
mhm,
the calcium, but they are
mhm,
they because why? Because cannabis in particular is very um, unique in terms of its calcium in the way in which it deals with calcium. It's a plant that uptakes calcium extremely aggressively.
hmm,
And if you look at the research that has been done in mononutrient deficiencies in cannabis, where they take out nutrients one by one and try to cause a deficiency in a cannabis plant, with calcium, you see no problems for like 3 weeks when you remove it. And then when you see an issue, it's normally not a calcium issue. When you see this thing that people call a calcium deficiency in cannabis, which happens around the mid canopy, and it's like these, these brown specks on the plants.
mhm,
That what if you Google cannabis deficiency, calcium deficiency, you'll find these pictures.
yeah,
When you actually do a tissue analysis of those leaves, they are calcium sufficient. They don't have a calcium deficiency.
hmm,
This makes sense because calcium is an immobile nutrient. Basically, where the plant fixes it, it remains there forever. So in all plants, you would expect to see calcium deficiencies in the growing tips, never in the mid canopy. Because if you lack any calcium, you wouldn't get it in the places that have already grown, already have the calcium they needed. They are not getting any like deficiency because they captured what they needed a while ago. So what we actually are observing is a toxicity of other things because you don't have calcium uptake. Other things are suddenly able to be taken up way faster, and these things cause that problem.
interesting.
But it's not a calcium deficiency, but it is fixed by calcium. So
All right.
you have this, and it's weird. Like it is not common. Whenever you withdraw calcium from a plant, it shows calcium deficiencies usually very quickly, always in the growing tips, and very few research papers in. I think only one paper that does hemp mononutrient deficiencies was able to get a true calcium deficiency in cannabis, and as you expected, it shows in the growing tips, not in the. But it is so good at calcium uptake that in normal nutrient solutions, there's so much that that's never a problem. And it's also present. It's very hard to like not get calcium in, like it's present everywhere. Um, but the fact that cannabis uptakes it so aggressively, it can help correct a bunch of other issues that might develop regarding, for example, pH changes or regarding the uptake of other things that might be, if you have, for example, an extremely high magnesium uptake or potassium uptake or sodium or something like that, then calcium can help straight that up. So
Interesting.
it is not like by chance that the cannabis greener product is a calmant. Like it is definitely because that's what works
Super
in
interesting. I like
cannabis.
that. I mean, that really, I think it's going to stir people's thinking up a little bit, right? And I mean, that's a good thing. The goal here is to, trigger different viewpoint and trigger, a different mindset. So, the way you look at your garden and the way, we just take these assumptions for so long and we don't really consider anything else. So I think, the points that you just hit on are really going to expand the thinking of a lot of cultivators out there just to, sit back and think about it again, before they just make these assumptions that they've been making for so long.
Yeah, and part of that points to maybe we have been overusing calcium. Because I mean, when you look at cannabis, at leaf tissue analysis of cannabis plants, you'll see that cannabis leaves will tend to be around 9-10% calcium by the end of your flowering period. So they are excessively high in calcium because calcium doesn't go anywhere.
Got it.
So if a plant transpires a drop of water, the calcium that was in that drop of water will stay in that leaf where it was transpired. So as you know, when we grow the cannabis plants after around week 4 in flower, the leaf production slows down to a halt. It's very, very slow, but those leaves keep on transpiring. They are still transpiring. So all the calcium just builds up and it builds up. And so should we build it up so much?
That'd be an interesting study, right?
Maybe we shouldn't build it up so much. Maybe we don't need to build it up that much. So it's interesting to wonder. It's also interesting to note that when you look at like the labs that do tissue analysis from cannabis will usually include like an average of what they get from their clients. So you'll get your results and they'll report the average of their clients so that you can see like what the average cannabis plant looks like, because they suppose that the average will be healthy. Like
with all the tests that they do, they assume that the average.
They assume that like well, I mean, I would also suppose that the people doing tissue analysis aren't very happy with their plants for like a significant percentage.
Yeah, that's a good point.
If your plants were perfect, why would you be inclined to do tissue analysis? But well, it is done as a routine in facilities just to learn and to as a quality control measure. But that's besides the point. So what I was saying is that the average calcium content that these people report will usually be around the 4 to 5% range. When for all dicots that I know that are not cannabis, the healthy tissue will be between 1 and 2%. So why are we growing cannabis that is so calcium rich?
But like you mentioned too, I mean, it would depend on when you would take that sample from what part of the plant, because if it's accumulating and it doesn't go anywhere, then
absolutely.
That's something to factor in, right? Like you should compare the newest growth to the oldest growth perhaps and see what that accumulation is like.
But even then, your newest growth keeps getting older. Like if you take the newest leaves in week 8, those newest leaves might be like 2 weeks old still, because they're just growing much slower. So even the newest will be way older. So it accumulates around the plant nonetheless. But you do have a point in that the age is important, but most samples are taken before week 2 or 3 of flower. Most are taken before that.
In the vegetative stage, usually.
Yeah, or at the most they're taken in day 42. Like because people will take the opportunities when they defoliate to send samples sometimes. But if we assume that most of the tissue is taken between like veg and week 2, and most of the samples that I've seen from growers that are feeding normal solutions, their calcium will be around that mark, around the 4% mark. It will be really high compared to like what a normal dicot should have in its tissue. And this leads us to believe, and there will be more research coming up this year, not from me, but from other colleagues like Bruce Buckby in Utah State and Nirit Bernstein at the Volcan Institute in Israel, that will show that cannabis is like an active uptaker of calcium, which is very particular for cannabis, I believe.
What do you think that's going to do to the industry?
I mean, not much.
Not much. Just
Not that much.
better understanding.
I mean, if you're growing great cannabis, that's you're still gonna grow great cannabis. I think what happens is that since we've been feeding so much calcium all the time, and the breeders have been feeding high calcium, the strains that are selected right now are particularly good at dealing with high calcium. So maybe if we move to lower calcium, we might be able to go to other strains that were previously discarded because the quality was bad or the yields weren't there, and it might be related with that calcium problem. This is something I've been able to explore with a few clients where plants that were previously like terrible and they were discarded because it's like they weren't yielding. When we put them under a different solution where they were not grown with aggressive amounts of calcium, then they performed significantly better. So the fact, the fact that Calmax have been used so much and that calcium is always high in these commercial solutions, it's pushed selection towards those plants. But maybe if you open up, if you open up the door of like managing the solution in other ways and using lower calcium, then you'll get other opportunities, and you might revisit some OGs that never got a chance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that should open up, some more possibilities and looking at the strain just one more time and say, well, let's take a different approach with it. Let's see if this strain is telling us something different when we feed it something different. That's fantastic.
Cannabis plants are extremely peculiar in their expressions, and it is really mind blowing when plants are grown under different circumstances. How you see them, like a plant grown under HPS or metal halide or LEDs or under the sun, will be substantially different, and it's like, whoa, like. Why is this plant now like I didn't know this plant could do this, and you just changed like your light.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it can happen as well with the nutrition.
Are you a cannabis grower looking for reliable and accurate pathogen testing for your plants? Look no further than MyFlora DNA. Their state-of-the-art lab offers testing for hop-latent viroid, fusarium, as well as other pathogens that can cause harm to your crops. Trust them to provide you the information that you need to ensure the health of your plants. And for a limited time, use discount code CloneCoach at checkout for up to 20% off your entire order. Don't let pathogens ruin your crop. Choose MyFlora DNA for all of your cannabis testing needs. Now back to the show. So let's transition a bit away from CalMag, but I think that once again, that was the most in-depth discussion on CalMag and the reality of it when it comes to cannabis and cultivation. So I love that we went through all that. Real quick, be it a myth or a misconception, but some people out there think that the raw salts, the fertilizers, kill the microbe activity in the root zone. Is there any truth to that? And or what could you, build off of that? Elaborate on that.
So it as everything, it depends.
Right.
So the microbials are used so the nutrients that the plant ends up getting from the microbes are the nutrients that you're feeding through a hydroponic solution. They are chemically exactly the same things. From the organics it gets, from like an organic media, it gets other things, but it gets exactly the same things in terms of like macronutrients at the very least from like the solution. However, some of those things are never present in amounts so large.
What do you mean?
For example, in a nutrient solution, you'll have, let's say, 160 ppm of nitrogen as nitrate. A soil will never have that amount of nitrate present because nitrates are flushed very effectively because they're very soluble, and they are produced in small quantities by the decomposition of organic matter, and the microorganisms there are used, they can support, I mean, they can live with nitrate present, but when you are feeding very large amounts of it, it distorts the like the natural balance that they are used to. Some microorganisms can be very sensitive to the concentration of these salts, to the ionic strength of the solution, so they can die if these concentrations are too high. Will you kill everything? No. Like a hydroponic solution will not sterilize a rock wool block. Otherwise, there wouldn't be fungal issues and there wouldn't be gnats living in that. Like, there wouldn't be algae. So
Right.
it clearly doesn't sterilize the thing. And it doesn't sterilize the soil by any means. But it does, like, reduce your diversity, because imagine you start with a big group of microbes. When you apply a fertilizer that has a high concentration, you're basically selecting for the ones that can survive under high salinity. So you're basically cutting your biodiversity to only the ones that can survive those conditions. So yeah, it kills some microbes.
Got it.
Will it be like whether, if you wanted to kill less of those microbes, then you just need to feed lower concentrations, or you can feed concentrations that are more what those microbes are going to be used to, because those microbes they can live with some amounts of all these chemicals, because that's exactly what the plant uptakes in organic media or in normal media or in hydroponic media. So you can feed way smaller amounts.
So the chemical composition is the same, right, at the true element form of it, right? So, but like you said, the addition of the concentration of that salinity and the concentration of the total composition of what you're feeding is what could stifle and kill off some of those microbes that just can't handle that level.
Yeah, and it also, if you're only feeding that, like it might also be present for too long relative to what it normally would be, because like if you're always feeding high nitrogen, those microorganisms would probably experience high nitrogen for very small periods of time, and suddenly they're exposed to high nitrogen like all the time. So
Uh-huh.
I mean, I am not like a huge fan of the mixed approach, because like of you doing if you're doing a living soil and you're also like trying to feed salts into it, because you're not getting the benefit of like having full control over the nutrition, because you don't know what the soil is contributing, and you're also not getting like the full benefits of the soil because you're affecting its biochemistry with like your salt input. So it is I
I
rather
think
commit with with one approach.
yeah, I think the more common, like for me at least, I like using microbial inoculants, right? Where there's usually, different species of bacillus, probably some trichoderma for biofungicide protectant, some humic acid, some kelp, some molasses, things like that. And, aiding in
Yeah.
the uptake and the transport as well, right? That should help the plant uptake and transport some of those elements as well.
So that's a controversial question in the sense in the
Okay.
sense that in the sense that in soil conditions, if there are issues with the uptake of these things because of their scarcity, those microbials will definitely help, and that has been shown like beyond any reasonable doubt. However, if you're under conditions where the presence of those things, where the environment is perfect, then those microbials are not going to be needed for uptake. Like they are not going to provide an additional level of uptake. They are going to provide maybe other benefits, but they are not going to benefit uptake. However, things might not be perfect,
Right.
so they can help you hedge for like a case where things are not perfect, which
Right.
most of the time they aren't. So I mean, you lose nothing except the money if it for the microbes. If it normally those microbials are, you need to be careful with like not overdoing them, because those things are oxygen sinks in the end. They require, many of them require oxygen to live. So if
Uh-huh.
you add like a crap ton of them, then you will starve roots for oxygen because those things need to live. So you need to just like use them
Create a
rationally.
harmonious balance, right?
Yeah, and you know, like it's perfectly okay to like take a I don't know, a cocoa block or something and apply
Hmm.
microbes to it. But I think that the objectives there are different than like when you're talking about like a living soil, right? Because
Right.
you're really not relying on those micronutrients, on those microbes for any sort of nutrient uptake or nutrient processing. Those are just there. I would say their main benefit would be to just occupy the ecologic niche so that you don't get some other pathogen there, like killing the roots. Um, and they might help if, for example, one day you did not irrigate, or one, they might help you with salinity
The
stress. If like,
stressors.
yeah, I mean, as I say, if you're perfect, they might do nothing, but then who is, right?
Right. Right. That's a good point. And once again, good way to just kind of address the perspective on it, right? Assuming everything's perfect, of course we don't need any additional additives or additional aid. But whose life is perfect? And especially more commonly nowadays,
Yes, yeah, and if you're growing like 1,000 plants, and God, like it will
you're gonna
never
need
be,
all
it
the
will
bit
never
of
be.
insurance
Yeah,
that
there
you
are
could
some
take.
cases where they're used, like if you're growing under rock wool, the efficient colonization of a rock wool block is something that is still, I think, debatable. Like
Mm.
it's still hard to show whether a rock wool block can really be colonized microbially effectively, just because the media itself doesn't lend itself that well to microbial inoculation, and the roots themselves are not like they they are limited in their ability to be able to host microorganisms directly.
Interesting.
Um, but I mean, yeah, I mean, in the end, if you use them rationally, yeah, there I'd see no problem with their use, and they can often help you prevent pathogens, if anything. Like,
Absolutely. Keep the good defenses up is what I say. Just have your guards up. Be preventative. Keep the good defenses up, and your plant would just be a little bit stronger in that sense to help defend itself. Let's go from microbes, as we just touched on here, into another very common product that's around nowadays. That's nothing new, but it's newer to the industry and newer to being more common in use, which is hypochlorous acid. So I know in one of your blog posts, I believe you even mentioned how to make your own hypochlorous acid. But let's touch on that for a little bit. What is it? What are the benefits of it? And how should we be using it in our gardens?
so hypochlorous acid is basically what you get if you. So let's imagine bleach, our common bleach, which is sodium
Uh-huh.
hypochlorite. So that hypochlorite is an anion. So it's OCl. So it's an anion that exists in basic pH. When the pH is dropped, that gets protonated and it becomes HOCl, and that is your hypochlorous acid. Hypochlorous acid is neutral, it's not an anion. And
You go from kind of alkali down to more of a neutral pH.
so, yeah, so it is going to be at around above pH 8, it will be an anion. And then when you move to pH 6, it will be protonated and it will become HOCl, which is like electrically neutral. The OCl minus is negatively charged and the HOCl is just electrically neutral. This fact that it's electrically neutral makes a big difference in its ability to kill things, because bacteria and other microorganisms don't have a lot of control with the transport of things that are small and electrically neutral, because they are a lot like water. They look electrically a lot like water from like a molecular perspective. So
Okay.
they can easily go through membranes, and then they kill these things much more effectively than like the anionic form. However, if you take bleach and you put it in a hydroponic solution and it's at a pH 6, that bleach, that hypochlorite will turn into hypochlorous acid. Every time you have bleach and you put it in an acidic pH, it will become hypochlorous acid. However, hypochlorous acid is unstable. So it turns into chlorine gas if there's enough of it, or if the pH is too acidic. So you should never add an acid to bleach, because if you try to
Right.
lower the pH of like a bottle of Clorox, you'll just kill yourself, because it will turn into chlorine gas, because the concentration is so high that when it turns into hypochlorous acid, it will decompose instantly into chlorine gas, and you will you will die. So in general,
Rewind that if you need to, everybody, please. Just so you
do
don't play
not do,
chemist in the grow.
yeah,
Please, please, please.
do not add acid to Clorox. So
Yes.
like if you take like a drop of Clorox in a hydroponic solution and like lower the pH to 6, that will turn into hypochlorous acid. Normally, commercial solutions of hypochlorous acid will be at around 200 ppm or less, and that's because there's like a regulatory um, like safe haven for solutions that are below that concentration. They don't need to do a lot of registration. They're very easy to manufacture and sell,
Hmm.
because if you go above that, then there's a lot of safety requirements in the manufacturing. But if you
Right.
stay
And
below, it's
claims.
like it's like very easy for you to make it. So manufacturers will make a 200 ppm solution, and they will sell that to you, and you can use that. So it is definitely like, if you have a bottle of Clorox, like you could definitely make a ton of hypochlorous acid with that for like very, very little cost, uh, just by diluting it to like the 200 ppms, and then adding the stabilizers and adjusting the pH. The blog post that you mentioned explains pretty much how to do that. You can do it that way. You can also buy the hypochlorous acid already made at
Hmm.
a substantial markup. And the other choice you have is to buy an electrolytical generator, so that you can like create hypochlorous acid yourself, which is just basically, this hypochlorous acid is just generated with electrolysis of a basically brine solution.
Okay.
And then you can create your own hypochlorous acid. That way, the problem is that the concentration will be hard. You can use active chlorine strips to measure concentration of active chlorine in your final solutions, but you will have some issue measuring like the concentrations from your own electrolytical setup if you get one. In commercial facilities, the problem with using bleach is that bleach decomposes with time, which I don't know if
Hmm.
your viewers know that, but bleach degrades with time quite substantially. So after 3 months, your bleach will probably be like half as concentrated as it was when you bought it. So if you need to add a consistent amount of chlorine, the amount of bleach that you need to add from the same bottle will change as a function of time.
Right. So, what about the actual use of the hypochlorous acid? How effective is it? What is it most effective with? What is the best use of it?
It's effective against many things, many pathogens. It will kill fungal spores, bacterial spores at pretty low concentrations. If you have like 4 ppms of active chlorine from hypochlorous acid, it will do that. I'm currently writing, in fact, a literature review on the use of chlorine, all those forms of chlorine in horticulture,
Interesting.
which I hope to publish later this year. But yeah, it basically you can use it for sanitizing in general. Uh, the caveat might be HLV. Like, like HLV is a cyclic, like a viroid, and that thing is like super stable. And it doesn't, like, the advantages that hypochlorous acid has of penetrating membranes and all that to kill bacteria or fungal spores, they don't apply to a viroid because it's already exposed to everything.
Hmm.
Um, so there's still no data about hypochlorous acid and its effectiveness against HLV. So I just don't know if it
Yeah, and
is
most people
effective or not.
wouldn't assume so. I mean, HLV is, for people that don't know what that is, that's a hoplite viroid, which is kind of swept the cannabis industry over these last few years and really caused major damage. And as we say, it's a viroid. It's not just a virus. So it's a lot tougher to address and kill and remediate within your plants, or addressing it with even common, alcohol, or what you assume is a sanitizer that's killing everything. But that's good to know. I mean, so even at those 200 ppm levels of the hypochlorous acid or less, because that would be the concentrated form that most people would sell you. Diluting that down, so even still the single digit ppm levels of the hypochlorous acid in the solution is enough to kill microbes.
Even sub that they can be effective.
Interesting.
Yeah, just because it is so much more active. However, there's a caveat, and it's that it will run out faster. So if you have an organic load that's higher in the solution, it will take way more frequent additions of it for it to work. It's not like, because if you have like a solution that has a ton of bacteria in it and you add 2 ppm of hypochlorous acid, it will basically kill a few and then run out.
Got it.
So this is why the ORP is generally like a better way to measure the concentration of solutions. And also worth mentioning, there has been there was sort of a big issue in Europe like a decade ago with the use of these chlorine sanitizing techniques. This issue of the hypochlorous acid reacting and all that is also why ORP is a more preferred measure of adding enough of it than the actual like concentration target.
Yeah, that is a phrase that I've seen associated with the hypochlorous acid quite a bit, is the ORP.
But I was also going to say that in Europe, like 10 years ago, there was a big push against chlorine sanitizers because people started finding significant amounts of chlorate in tomatoes. So chlorate, which is an anion, ClO3, is toxic to humans and can be very harmful to health. And if you're using a chlorine sanitizer, it could potentially generate chlorate in tissue because this hypochlorate or hypochlorous acid could be actually taken up by the plant and end up generating those species in plant tissue. I haven't seen any actual data from cannabis plants quantifying chlorate or perchlorates in flowers, but I think it is reasonable to assume that it could happen. If you use a chlorine-based sanitizer in a cannabis crop, I think that the possibility of having chlorate in a product that you smoke is there, and that it is a very good oxidizer, so it would probably lead to wire ash, but it is definitely probably not good for your health. So when using these chlorine sanitizers, that's also a possibility of an unknown there that is worth considering.
Is there a common test, or is that a plant tissue test that could be another viewed, or how would that be analyzed?
It's a pretty specialized lab test, and I don't know anyone who's doing it right now for cannabis. So but it is something that I've had in my mind for a while, and a reason why I generally do not recommend this. Another problem that you have with hypochlorous acid and with chlorine sanitation in general is that it reacts with ammonium and it generates chloramines in solution. If your fertilizer contains any ammonium, it will generate chloramines in solution, and these are way more toxic to the plants. And these can also build up in plant tissue. So this is another reason why chlorine-based sanitation could be like problematic when used in nutrient solutions.
It's a very interesting point. And, I'm glad that you're touching on, the entire aspect of it, right? I mean, there's benefits, it's the chemistry of it, how it works, but things to also consider or to, look out for potentially. So I'm glad that you gave the full picture there.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I have never committed to like standing behind any brands or sponsoring any particular fertilizer or product brands, and it's because I being like an independent consultant, not having to stand behind any of them, I can criticize them all fully. So I don't
Yeah.
need to be especially cheerful about any of the products.
Right, right. No, no, you're neutral. I had a mentor describe it to me as being neutral, be Switzerland, right? Just do you, be nice to everybody, but you don't have to be everybody's favorite, or you don't
Yeah,
have
I
to
mean,
be
you know,
everybody's
there's
best friend.
there everything has its use cases and everything has its pros and its cons, but you know, the people selling them all obviously focus on the pros. They are not so much
Right.
interested on the cons that you might get from them, but it's always good to hear with the problems that you might have from them.
Absolutely. So let's transition into what you alluded to earlier, which is Hydrobuddy, which is your software, right? That's what you use to aid in the formulation of all of your nutrient solutions. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Hydrobuddy is a piece of software that allows you to create nutrient formulations from scratch, from the raw materials. So basically, you provided the targets that you want to hit, and it tells you how much of the raw salts to add. It's all it does. Basically, you have a formulation that you want to reach, and you have some list of nutrients that you want to use of raw salts, and it basically bridges the gap between the two, which sounds like a trivial task, but it gets old when you have to do it a lot.
I bet. I bet. And that's the thing with software. We use software to help us, produce more, calculate more, be more accurate. So, there's definitely benefit in having software in our lives, especially when it comes to math and, down to, decimal points of grams and accuracy. So, there's benefit there. I could see that. Um, I wanted to touch on silica or silicon. It being a non-essential element for plants, or it being an essential element. Let's dive into silica a little bit. I feel like that's one of those elements or products that are out there in the hydroponic industry that you know have a lot of claims, but they also don't have a lot of claims, or like it's a benefit but it's no harm. So what are your thoughts on silica and how it's portrayed and or used in the current hydroponic industry?
So silicon, we know. I mean, there's like a mountain of scientific research showing that for plants where it's not an essential element, for monocots, for what we would often call grasses,
Uh-huh.
it is essential. Like grass, your grasses that you see there for things like rice, it is an essential element. Those plants die without silicon. They need it to survive.
Got it.
But for plants like cannabis, which is like a relatively poor uptaker of silicon, it is not essential. A cannabis plant can live perfectly without any silicon. However, it is now well established, I think, that it has substantial benefits in terms of disease resistance.
Hmm.
So I cannot say much about any other benefits. I haven't seen any conclusive data that supports increases in yields or in quality. But there are two things in cannabis. One of them is resistance to fungal disease, that is 100% established. It increases the resistance to PM and other fungal diseases by a mile. And second, it increases the structural integrity of trichomes a lot.
Hmm.
So if you do like a microscopy analysis of trichomes with and without silicon, you'll see like a big difference when you have silicon in the plant. It's the trichome structure is just much better. And that means that when you're harvesting, they'll break less. You'll have, you'll have less keef. You'll have, so it is overall gonna be better for
So
your for harvesting.
how does it what is it doing to aid in that disease resistance?
So it's basically making the plant cell walls more like glass. So it's making them more structurally rigid. And
Got it.
when the fungal pathogens germinate, they need to penetrate the tissue. And if the tissue is like glass, it will be significantly harder for them to do that. So it is gonna be way harder for fungal spores to germinate in tissue that is that much chemically harder than like normal tissue. So it does aid substantially to prevent spore germination, but it is no like miracle, you know.
Right,
If you
right.
have a grow room that has low VPD at night, where half of your plants are infested with PM, the others won't be saved by silicon. Like nothing will save them.
Yeah, it's that's not a it's not a fungicide, but it's indirectly aiding the the cell walls to be stronger, more rigid. So let the hyphae, right? That's the germination root that
Yeah, like
taps into the cell
the
wall.
fungal analog of roots. Yeah, so they will try to penetrate that tissue, and then they will find way more resistance from it, and they will be less successful at
Yeah,
it.
I heard similar things with that cell wall structure when it comes to the amount of calcium that's also in those cell walls. Is there any truth to that or any kind of
Yeah, so
elaboration there?
more calcium makes a I mean, yeah, it does, but not to the same extent. Like
Got it.
calcium does help with cell wall structure, but silicon is just takes it to another level, you know.
Or
Uh,
maybe the I may have remembered it wrong, but they said maybe like when it germinates into the calcium, that since there's no moisture, that lack of moisture is the way that it's aiding in preventing that germination. That kind of lack of moisture when it hits that cell that's really filled up with calcium.
so I haven't seen like evidence in that direction.
Okay.
So I'm not familiar with the research in that direction. So if it is there, I apologize. I haven't read it.
No, I mean there's a
but
lot of stuff out there.
like to the best of my knowledge, I haven't heard about that. Definitely, if you have a calcium deficient plant, it will be more sensitive to fungal disease. So will a plant that's deficient in many other things, because it's just
Hmm.
its defenses are just weaker.
Hmm.
Um, we do like apply like in plants that have a hard time uptaking calcium. We do apply calcium foliars and all these things. Cannabis is not one of those plants by any means.
As a
So
reminder, right? As a
so,
reminder.
so like does it make sense to like overfeed calcium to like prevent fungal disease? I don't think it does. I think that silicon does a great job, and I think that the most common problem that people have with disease, with fungal disease in particular, and we're talking about mainly two branches here in cannabis. We're talking about PM and botrytis, which are the two big ones in cannabis.
Hmm.
So in the case of PM, it's environmental management and canopy management. People are one staying at VPD levels that are too low, either in the room as a whole or in particular zones in the room where you have microclimates that are low VPD. And low
Hmm.
VPD at night, what I tell people is the more a room feels like a basement, the more PM it will have. So if you have a room that is exactly like a basement, then PM will grow in it, because that's where you have fungal growth, right? They like dark, moist places that are at like relatively lower temperatures.
Right, with little
So
airflow where it could just without any disturbance.
yeah, exactly. So if you are there, you'll get PM. And then the other reason is poor canopy management, like you're not like cutting your undergrowth, you're not properly clearing canopy, so you have leaves on top of leaves that are rotting. That, well,
Hmm.
then what do you expect? The VPD on top of a leaf will tend to be quite low because the leaf is transpiring. If you have a leaf on top of a leaf, then basically between those two leaves it's super moist, and you will get PM there. So I mean, it's all those things. And in the case of botrytis, then we usually have a problem with structure, or with VPD as well. You have very high humidity, but mostly with structure. Your flowers are just too big and too dense, and the spores get there, and then that thing grows with the spores inside, and they just like explode inside.
Yeah,
And big butts are for beginners, as they say.
that's interesting. Yeah, I mean it's true because the bigger the buds, I mean, you have to really, when it comes to scouting, you really got to know how deep to look and know that botrytis is stemming from the inside out. And by the time it's easy to spot on the outside, oh, the whole inners of the working of that bud is completely, covered at that point.
Yeah, I remember a colleague of mine consulted with a grower once that I visited as well, not consulting with them, but just was invited to visit them. And they did not have the labor to harvest a crop, so they actually were gonna run it for 9 weeks, and they ended up running it another week, so 10 weeks. And then when they harvested, they got 25% more yield
Hmm.
from the crop, but 80% of the crop went to the garbage because of botrytis. So,
Yeah,
so,
it's
so yeah, like, what's the point of having a bigger flower if it's all gonna be fungal disease? Like, better to have, like, if you have proper toppings and proper branching, and then you get smaller flowers that are all way better, then that's
yeah,
way better for everyone. Like,
absolutely. Well, Daniel, what do you think is like the one, be it a foliar spray or maybe a wetting agent or something very common that gets used in almost every garden that you should or give a try to make yourself? Since you have so many recipes on your website and stuff, what is something out there that somebody could kind of dip their toes into making their own, be it a foliar spray or something like that? What do you think would be the best option?
um, to like make yourself.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so I think that there's some relatively simple PM things that you can do. PM, like IPM sprays for PM,
Okay.
that you can do. I wrote an article on my website on how to make some for oil based, like vegetable oil based sprays for PM, and I think that's pretty easy. And basically, like, vegetable oils will prevent spore germination. So like soybean, corn oil, all these, sunflower oil, all these vegetable oils will prevent spore germination. So with like a couple additives and some of that oil, you can make a spray that is really good at preventing spore germination. That's basically what you get in many of these, more like a lot of these products like plant therapy, uh, or other similar IPM products are based on this principle that oils prevent spore germination, and
Hmm.
you can experiment with those products yourself. I also did a video on Calmax, so if you wanna give creating your own Calmax a shot, you can also try that. Yeah, I also have a YouTube channel that, with the same name, Science in Hydroponics, where people can go to learn more about, well, plant, like, solution chemistry, and often plant physiology, and nutrient preparation. I have a ton of videos showing how I do it, and how to do it more accurately or less accurately, or how to create your own, like, calibration solutions, for example, for meters, which can be
Yeah, I
useful.
see another one too where you know how to make the stabilized orthosalicylic acid solution with only three inputs.
Yeah, that one I don't recall. If you look at a more recent post that I wrote about silicon, like, this entire silicon thing with all these different silicon inputs has been has been a focus of my mind for the past, like, 2 years, because I I wondered, why are these people selling, like, different forms of silicon? Why is it better? Is it better?
Okay. Uh-huh.
You have three types of silicon. You have the potassium silicates, you have the acid stabilized silicic acids, and you have the organosilicon sources, like the Grow Genius product that uses these organosilicon. And I did some tests, thanks with one of Bruce Buckby's students at Utah State. We did some tests preparing acid stabilized silicon and preparing normal silicon from potassium silicate. And then I did some tests using also organosilicon, and then doing the dilutions and seeing if they last longer, are they more stable once you dilute them, are they chemically different. They're all the same in the end. All the same in the end. In the end, once you put them in the nutrient solution, in the end, they're all exactly the same thing. So the stabilized concentrated silicic acids that's a whole roundabout, that's a waste of time. The organosilicon products, when you compare by silicon per silicon atom, they are way more expensive. So potassium silicate is your best bet. And there's a ton of scientific literature on potassium silicate. And there are, if you go to that blog post I wrote about like common questions asked about silicon, you need to use it properly, because if you use it improperly, it won't work. So you need to use it properly. If you use it properly, it's the cheapest, best source of silicon that you find in the end. At the end, when they're all dilute in your hydroponic solution, they're all the same. I couldn't tell the difference in any of the lab tests done. The silicon is just exactly the same.
That's so are there, like you said, there's products out there in the market that are these different forms of silica, and really the potassium silicate is the one to look for?
Yeah, that's the cheapest. You only need to learn how to use it properly. So there are some caveats to how to use it when you prepare the concentrated solutions, when you dilute them, the order in which you add them. You need to learn how to use it properly, while some of those others are more, especially like the organosilicon is way more carefree in how you use it, because it basically reacts with the water and generates silicic acid almost like instantly. And while the potassium silicate goes through a chemical transformation process that requires some particular steps. Not hard steps, like just like do things in like a specific order. But in the end, the cost doesn't justify that easiness, because you're paying through the nose for that. You're paying 10 times more or something, even like almost 100 times more. It doesn't make a lot of sense to do that. There's also like the potassium silicate has so much research. There are like a ton of papers over the last 30 years about potassium silicates. There are a handful of acid stabilized silicon papers, a handful. There aren't any organosilicon papers. And there are a handful.
Seems to be the same as what you described. The amount of papers and like the pricing, how you just mentioned, it seems to be the right ratio, ratio.
And like the silicic acid stabilized papers, some do show results in foliar spraying, not in solution, better than the normal potassium silicate. But you need to bear in mind that the silicic acid stabilized solutions contain a bunch of stabilizing agents that are not inert to the plant. They contain boron, they contain often molybdenum, they can contain sugars, they can contain like sugar alcohols, like they can contain things like glycerin. So those things are not gonna be inert to the plant. The plant is actually gonna uptake those and react to them in some way. So you could be seeing good results because of those. And that's what I believe right now, because of all the evidence that I've seen, is that when you have papers where the acid stabilized silicon showed better results, it's just because the stabilizing agents were the ones doing something different to the plant. Because there's not a single paper that compares that has a control with the stabilizing agents, but not the silicon. So just like a control of the organosilicon against just the stabilizing agents.
And see that comparison.
And see that comparison, because like you're not adding things that are not inert to the plant. And like, maybe if you're spraying a lot of boron with the silicon, maybe that boron increased yields because of the boron, not because of the silicon that you were spraying. So with the acid stabilized silicon, there is a lot of additional effect from these things that is not properly accounted for in the scientific literature about them.
Right.
Which is probably why you don't see any like top tier journal studies on acid stabilized silicons. because the tests are not rigorous enough to account for all those side effects. Because on top of this, these acid stabilized silicones are a pain to make.
Got it. So
Because
it's more beneficial
yeah,
to have the combination.
concentrated silicon does not like to be stable under acidic conditions, and you're basically forcing it for no good reason, to be honest.
Got it. So lastly, to wrap up the, this nice in-depth, portion of the show for the silica, is it best to feed that via the nutrient solution as in the roots, or is it best to feed it as a foliar spray?
It's best to feed it through the roots because silicon is fully immobile. So if you spray it, you'll only get the silicon where you hit the plant. So any part you miss will have no silicon. And also, as the plant grows, anything that grows new won't have any silicon.
Got it.
So you should feed it to the roots so that everything that is growing gets it. Otherwise, you'll get like an overlay effect, right? You sprayed once and that part got it. And then you spray it again and that part that had already got it gets more. And then the new part just gets the small amount from the previous part. So when it comes to immobile things, it is usually better to feed them through the roots than to foliar feed them. You should only foliar feed them if there is a problem with the root transport of these things.
Got it. Right. But once again, assuming that you do have that uptake, you do have that transport, that's the best place to feed it so that it could go throughout the entire plant.
Yeah, definitely. And research has shown time and time again when it's compared in other dicots, root transport just works much better than the foliar spraying of the silicone.
Fantastic. Daniel, we are at the tail end of the show now. There's a question I like to ask every guest just to kind of get like a big picture vision of what, our hopes or dreams are for the future when it comes to this industry. So factoring in technology, factoring in the global economy, policy that's changing in, all these countries, what do you think the future of cannabis looks like for us in this industry?
So it depends on the time frame, right? So it is interesting because when you look at the fate of tropical plants in industry, the story tends to be similar. Cannabis is particular, but look, for example, at fresh cut roses, for example.
Okay.
Plants that grow best in tropical conditions. They were initially produced in greenhouses in the US. Then they started to be produced in the tropics. And then the tropics have so much additional DLI and so much lower labor costs that basically all rose production was killed. Like there is virtually no rose production right now in Colorado, for example, when before it was like a significant industry, because now Colombia produces 98% of the roses sold in the US. So there's like, whether that will happen or not with cannabis will depend on the legalities of the matter. But as soon as it's federally legal, I'm certain that you will start to see migration of the crop production to the equatorial regions of the world. And then once you get production in these equatorial regions, which will be managed by very big companies, because that's normally what happens, then the scenario for like the bulk industry might start looking a little bit grim in terms of like prices per pound, and I think it will be a long time. So I think there is still a bunch of time before that happens. There is still a bunch of time for indoor grows, and there is still a bunch of time before full federal legalization happens in the US and other countries. But yeah, what I see is increases in the focus over quality because many people are starting to grow more. So quantity being grown is only going to increase. So a focus on quality will happen. And as in the case of wine, I think that you will also see a focus on niche aspects of the plant, because cannabis has such large biodiversity I do see a lot of like niche spaces for people who focus on very particular. And this is why, in essence, I think that if you're worried about the survivability of the business, you should focus more on the genetic side of the business and on creating like unique lines that only you have access to, which is I think why I mean I am a big fan of like a very obscure thing in the industry
Which is?
that nobody
Oh,
does.
just like in general?
No, I mean I like the idea of grafting in cannabis,
Hmm.
and there have been a few research papers on grafting in cannabis. And you know how with grafting you have the advantage that nobody can like steal clones from you
Right.
because all plants are grafted together. So if you take a clone from like a scion of a graft, which a scion is the top part of a graft, if somebody takes a scion from you, they will get the mother plant of the scion, which is not going to have the same biochemistry as the graft. So there I think there is something in grafts too in terms of IP protection that is very interesting for the industry. Um, and that's something for you to work on, because that's something, these grafts can be done quite well in the cloning stage. So you're basically grafting two clones together.
Well, Daniel, I like where your head's at. I like your vision of the future, and we may need to work on some sort of grafting program for the vegetative state to create IP protected genetics for the future. I don't know. You see that? That's why I love, just what's the big picture like that? That's not something that's commonly talked about. So I like where your head's
No,
at there.
like, and it so far there's like hurdles in it, because every clone takes two clones because you're grafting, and it's not the most easy thing to do from like a manual perspective, but
Hey, there's
it can be
challenges and
done.
everything. We could overcome them.
It can be done really successfully. I'm sure with the right clone coach.
Yeah, yeah, and the right resources here, So for everybody listening, everybody watching, um, go to if you want to learn more, you want to get more in depth, you want to get better at the chemistry, the nutrients, the elements, the formulations, all of this. Where can people go to learn more about that, Daniel, and what resources should they be tapping into that you offer?
So basically, you can go to my website, scienceinghydroponics.com, and you can also look for my channel on YouTube at Science in Hydroponics. I'm also on Instagram with the same handle, Science in Hydroponics. Um, and you'll find all sorts of resources there. I never do any sort of cannabis specific thing anymore. So because of like how search engines and how these websites will treat anything cannabis specific differently. So
Hmm.
I only deal with cannabis normally through consulting. I also, however, participate on forums occasionally. So if you're in some cannabis forums, you might see me posting from time to time, just to help some people out there who might be having some issues.
Fantastic. Well, Daniel, thank you for joining Clone Talk today with me, Paul, the Clone Coach. This was a fantastic episode. It ran longer than the normal, but I couldn't turn it off. There's so much value in this episode, and I hope that everybody gives this another watch, another listen, goes to the resources, dives deeper, and starts cultivating just a little bit better. So I hope you gain value from watching. I'm Paul. I'm your Clone Coach. This has been another episode of Clone Talk. Daniel, thank you very much, and we'll catch you guys on the next one.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Attention licensed operators in California. Are you looking for high quality nursery stock? Look no further than Refined Genetics. They provide top-notch clones, teens, and seeds to ensure the success of your operation. No order is too big. For a limited time, use discount code CloneCoach for 10% off your first order. Don't miss out on this opportunity to secure a solid nursery partner. Contact sales@refinedgenetics.co. And yes, it's .co, not .com. Catch you on the next episode of Clone Talk. Do you want to be a guest on Clone Talk? It's easy. Just send me an email. heyclonecoach@gmail.com. We'll get you all set up. I look forward to having you on the next episode.